You arrive at the threshold of quantum detachment not through effort, but through an internal recognition that something in you can no longer sustain the weight of the timeline you have been holding. There is a subtle loosening, a quiet shift in the way your identity meets your experience. It is not dramatic, yet it is unmistakable. You sense a release of the familiar tension that once kept old patterns intact. Something inside is no longer willing to grip. Something is no longer willing to pretend the old momentum defines what comes next. This is the first signal the field receives. A softening. A surrender of the old architecture. The beginning of collapse. Quantum detachment is not turning away from your life. It is turning away from the illusion that you must hold it together. When you release the identity that believed it had to maintain the current timeline, the field immediately registers a shift in instruction. You are no longer broadcasting the frequency of the old story. You are no longer anchoring the emotional rhythms that once shaped your reality. Detachment is the moment the timeline loses your agreement. And when agreement dissolves, so does form. This loosening changes your internal atmosphere. The noise of resistance begins to fade, and in its absence, a deeper intelligence rises. The field becomes more responsive because you are no longer distorting it through effort or fear. You are no longer insisting that the familiar remain familiar. You are meeting the moment without gripping it. This is how collapse begins, not with force, but with the absence of force. As you soften, the timeline destabilizes. Patterns that once repeated automatically no longer find energetic ground to stand on. Momentum loses its direction. What once felt solid begins to feel transparent. You are not breaking anything apart, you are simply withdrawing the inner tension that once held it all in place. When identity relaxes, structure dissolves. This is the law. In this threshold state, the field is watching what you choose. Not through action, but through frequency. Your emotional atmosphere is your declaration. Your openness is your instruction. Your stillness is your signal. You stand at a quiet precipice where the old cannot move forward and the new has not yet taken form. And yet, this is not uncertainty. This is power. It is power because you are no longer bound by what was. You are no longer entangled with the patterns that once shaped your timeline. You are meeting reality with clean awareness, and clean awareness collapses anything built on tension. As you stand here, the field reorganizes around the neutrality you are allowing. The shift has already begun, simply because you recognize the threshold. If you recognize this threshold within yourself, stay within this frequency by subscribing to the channel. Linear continuity appears convincing only when you stand inside the emotional frequency that sustains it. The mind assumes events follow one another because of logic, sequence, or causality, yet what actually binds moments into a timeline is the emotional charge you continue to hold. This charge acts as an adhesive, stitching together experiences that match its resonance. When the charge persists, the story persists. When the charge dissolves, the story unravels. What seemed like a stable path was never held together by time, it was held together by you. As you begin to soften the emotional grip, the illusion of continuity weakens. The thread that once tied the past to the present loses its tension. The energetic cohesion that made the timeline appear linear begins to fade, and suddenly the path you thought you were on no longer feels inevitable. You realize the continuity was never natural, it was maintained through repetition of emotional tone. When tone changes, continuity collapses. This is why even a subtle shift in your inner state can dissolve years of momentum. The field follows frequency, not memory. Emotional adhesion works like a magnet. It pulls matching experiences into coherence with your inner state. When you harbor a charge, whether longing, fear, resentment, or hope, the field organizes itself around that charge, offering reflections that reinforce the emotional atmosphere. This creates the illusion of a consistent storyline. Similar experiences accumulate, not because time is linear, but because emotion is consistent. Once that emotional consistency ends, the magnetism dissipates. The storyline breaks apart. What you once believed was destiny becomes exposed as nothing more than resonance. When emotional charge dissolves, the timeline loses its structure. There is no longer a force knitting moments together into a coherent narrative. The past cannot project itself forward because the frequency that once connected it to the present has been released. This is the moment when collapse begins. It does not begin with action or decisions, it begins with the absence of charge. When you no longer feed the emotional current that once shaped your life, the timeline cannot sustain itself. Its continuity was dependent on your participation. This dissolution creates a sense of spaciousness. The mind may interpret it as uncertainty, but in truth it is freedom. Without the adhesive of old emotion, reality becomes fluid. New pathways appear not because they were newly created but because they were no longer obscured by the density of old resonance. You begin to perceive that linearity was a construct, a way of organizing repeated patterns into a story. Once the pattern breaks, the story dissolves, and you stand in a field that is no longer constrained by what was. Dissolving emotional charge is not a withdrawal from life, it is a withdrawal of agreement. You are no longer offering the energy required to validate an outdated trajectory. In that release, continuity dissolves. The timeline collapses, not with force, but with quiet inevitability. This changes everything. There is a moment when awareness turns inward and becomes aware of itself, and in that moment the entire field shifts. Nothing external changes, yet the momentum of the timeline you were sustaining begins to unravel. It happens quietly, almost imperceptibly, but its impact is immediate. When you notice your own state, when you witness the frequency you have been inhabiting, you step out of unconscious participation. You stop feeding the timeline with automatic resonance. The field registers this interruption instantly. Awareness breaks the spell. This moment is not about analyzing yourself or assessing your situation. It is a clean recognition, a pure seeing. You are not trying to change anything, you are simply awake to what is present. And because the field mirrors your state, the act of noticing becomes a new instruction. The old momentum depended on your unawareness. It depended on you reacting from habit, emotion, and identity. Once you witness the pattern instead of embodying it, the pattern can no longer continue with the same force. The energetic current loses coherence because the one sustaining it is no longer inside it. You have stepped into observation, and observation is neutrality. Recognition is a frequency shift. It dissolves the emotional texture that kept the old timeline in motion. When you see yourself clearly, without resistance or judgment, the charge diminishes. This is why collapse begins with recognition rather than effort. Effort strengthens the identity that sustains the pattern. Recognition dissolves it. When you recognize your state, you reclaim authorship. You stop being moved by the timeline and begin witnessing the mechanics that once felt inevitable. This witnessing changes everything because the field responds not to your thoughts, but to your level of consciousness. There is a subtle pivot here, one that cannot be forced. You are not trying to fix the timeline. You are not trying to redirect it. You are simply aware, and this awareness is a higher signal than any intention you could generate. The field responds to clarity, and clarity arises the moment you notice what you were previously entangled with. Momentum halts because you are no longer reinforcing it through unconscious identification. You have withdrawn the energy that held it in place. In this moment, the dominant timeline loses priority. The field begins to reorganize around the new signal of awareness. You become the still point rather than the participant in motion. You are not pushing anything away, you are simply no longer feeding it. The field notices this withdrawal immediately because your consciousness is its organizing principle. Awareness is not passive. It is directive. It tells the field that a new frequency is emerging, and the field responds by loosening its attachment to the trajectory you once embodied. Recognition is the gateway. It is the quiet trigger. It is the shift that requires no effort because it arises naturally when you stop running on momentum and begin seeing clearly. In the instant you notice yourself, the old timeline begins to collapse. Emotion is not a reaction to the timeline, it is the architecture that builds it. Every recurring emotional frequency becomes a structural beam, a vibrational pillar that shapes which experiences can assemble around you. Timelines are not sustained by events but by the emotional patterns that hold those events in coherence. When an emotion repeats, it becomes a framework. When it persists, it becomes a reality. And when it dissolves, the structure it upheld dissolves with it. You are not moving through a fixed sequence of circumstances. You are moving through the emotional frequencies you emit. Each frequency draws matching forms into arrangement, giving the appearance of continuity. What you call a timeline is simply the accumulation of experiences resonating with the same emotional signature. Change the signature, and the entire architecture reorganizes. The field is not loyal to memory. It is loyal to vibration. Recurring emotions carve out pathways within consciousness. They determine which possibilities feel accessible and which remain unseen. When an emotional state becomes familiar, the field presents reflections that align with that familiarity. This creates repeated patterns, not because you are destined to experience them, but because the emotional architecture keeps inviting them into form. The structure appears external, but it is built from within. You walk through your own frequency. Detachment weakens the beams of this architecture. When you loosen the emotional grip that once sustained certain frequencies, the structure loses integrity. It cannot continue shaping your reality with the same certainty. Detachment is not avoidance, it is the release of identification. When you stop feeding an emotion with attention and belief, it loses the strength to hold a timeline in place. The collapse begins long before anything external changes. It begins the moment the emotion is no longer reinforced. As the structure weakens, new pathways emerge. These pathways were always available, but they were overshadowed by the frequency you maintained. Emotional consistency creates perceptual narrowness, detachment opens the field. Without the scaffolding of old emotion, consciousness becomes spacious. Possibilities that were once incompatible with your emotional environment become visible. The field no longer filters your reality through the lens of a single dominant frequency. You begin to sense the multiplicity of timelines available to you. This shift is subtle yet profound. You are not forcing a new timeline, you are dissolving the one constructed from repetition. You are allowing the emotional blueprint behind your experiences to update. When the emotional architecture softens, so does the story. Patterns stop repeating because their foundation no longer exists. The field naturally moves to reorganize around the new frequency you are embodying. Detachment is the architect's release. It does not destroy, it clears space. It creates an opening where alternative structures can rise. And as the old architecture dissolves, the field prepares to mirror a new emotional reality, one that emerges not from effort, but from the freedom of your inner atmosphere. Coherence is the silent signal that instructs the field with absolute clarity. It is not the loudness of intention, nor the intensity of desire, but the harmony of your inner state that determines what reality organizes itself around. When your thoughts, emotions, and identity vibrate in agreement, you emit a clean frequency. This frequency becomes an unmistakable directive, a stabilizing tone that tells the field exactly which timeline you are selecting. The field responds not because you demand it, but because coherence leaves no conflicting instructions. Force scatters the signal. Effort fractures it. Whenever you try to control outcomes through pushing or insisting, you introduce static into the frequency. The field cannot stabilize around mixed signals, so it reflects the confusion you broadcast. This is why forcing reality rarely produces lasting transformation. It may create temporary movement, but it cannot hold a new timeline in place because the internal tone remains incoherent. The field follows the deepest frequency you carry, not the surface-level effort you exert. Coherence, however, is unmistakable. It arises when you stop fighting yourself. When the mind relaxes, when emotion settles, when identity softens into alignment, a unified signal emerges. This signal is not created, it is revealed. It is the natural state beneath resistance. And because it is unified, the field responds immediately. Reality does not need to be convinced. It needs to be given a singular frequency to mirror. When coherence appears, the field reorganizes with precision. This is why detachment plays such an essential role in coherence. When you release the emotional adhesions that once distorted your signal, the noise dissolves. What remains is clarity. Not the clarity of intellectual understanding, but the clarity of vibrational integrity. You are no longer sending the field contradictory information. You are no longer asking for expansion while broadcasting fear, or seeking change while radiating tension. Coherence replaces struggle with alignment. The moment this alignment stabilizes, the timeline begins to shift. A coherent state does not strain toward outcome. It does not negotiate with the field. It simply is. And its very being becomes instruction. Coherence broadcasts a timeline selection that cannot be misunderstood. It does not ask the field to change, it informs the field of the change that has already occurred within you. The field then reflects that inner shift with absolute fidelity. This is the mechanism behind what appears as sudden transformation. There is nothing sudden about it. The alignment preceded the manifestation. When coherence deepens, timelines converge around it. The field reorganizes to support the frequency you hold consistently. This is why coherence stabilizes a new timeline more effectively than any action you could take. You cannot outperform your frequency. You cannot out-strategize your vibration. The timeline you inhabit is the one that matches the signal you emit effortlessly. Coherence is the quiet power that rewrites reality. It is the signal the field trusts. And when coherence becomes your baseline, reality has no choice but to reorganize around you. Reality behaves as a quantum mirror, reflecting not your intentions, not your words, but the vibrational clarity you hold in the present moment. It does not interpret your desires or decode your plans. It simply mirrors the frequency you embody. When your inner state is tangled with resistance, confusion, or gripping, the mirror reflects those distortions. When your inner state becomes quiet, aligned, and clear, the mirror reflects coherence. This reflection is precise because the field is not guessing, it is responding to the signal you emit without ambiguity. The mirror does not judge. It does not delay. It does not filter. It responds instantly to the dominant frequency within you. This is why reality often shifts the moment your internal atmosphere shifts. The field is not withholding anything, it is waiting for coherence. The reflection cannot stabilize when the signal is fractured. But when clarity emerges, the mirror becomes exact. It displays what you have become rather than what you are striving toward. Detachment is the polishing of this mirror. When you release emotional adhesion, when you stop gripping the identity that once held the timeline in place, the distortions clear. Detachment removes the residue of past frequencies that continue to echo through the present. It wipes away the smudges created by fear, control, and resistance. You are not trying to change the reflection, you are cleaning the surface that produces it. Once the mirror is clear, the field can no longer project the outdated image. It must reflect your current frequency. Outdated reflections dissolve when they no longer find resonance within you. The field cannot show you what you are not. When you shift, the old reflection has no energetic anchor. Patterns you once encountered repeatedly no longer appear because the emotional signature that summoned them is gone. The mirror cannot conjure a reflection without a frequency to source it from. Detachment removes the source. This is why collapse feels sudden. The mirror has nothing left to reflect from the past. A polished mirror does not exaggerate or diminish. It reveals. When your inner state becomes steady and quiet, the field responds with precision. The reflection becomes aligned, coherent, and unmistakably connected to who you are being. You are not forcing a new image onto the mirror, you are allowing it to reveal what has always been available beneath the noise. Detachment reveals the inherent order beneath the turbulence of resistance. The quantum mirror effect is not mystical, it is mechanical. Frequency in, frequency out. Clarity in, clarity out. Identity in, experience out. The moment you shift the signal, the reflection reorganizes. The field does not need time to update, it adjusts as soon as the vibration stabilizes. When you realize this, you stop trying to manage the reflection and focus instead on the quality of the signal. You recognize that everything you encounter is an exact echo of the state you hold. Detachment is the beginning of clarity, and clarity is the beginning of transformation. In the quantum mirror, nothing is hidden. Everything is revealed. Identity sustains timelines more powerfully than thought or emotion alone. What you believe yourself to be generates a continuous vibrational current, and that current reinforces the patterns you encounter. When an identity becomes habitual, the field arranges itself around that identity, mirroring the assumptions held within it. You do not merely experience reality, you experience the version of reality that matches who you believe you are. This is why certain patterns repeat even when you consciously desire change. The identity beneath the desire is still broadcasting the old frequency. Most identities operate unconsciously. They form through repetition, emotional charge, and early interpretations of experience. Without noticing, you adopt roles, expectations, and narratives that shape the timelines you inhabit. These identities create momentum. They keep you aligned with familiar trajectories, not because the trajectories are true, but because they are consistent with who you think you are. When identity remains unexamined, its momentum becomes self-perpetuating. The field cannot reflect a reality that contradicts the identity you embody. Detachment weakens this momentum. When you stop gripping the familiar sense of self, the field loses the anchor that held the old timeline in place. Detachment is not the dismissal of identity, it is the softening of identification. You no longer cling to the assumptions that once defined you. You no longer reinforce the emotional charge that kept you repeating old patterns. As the grip loosens, the identity dissolves, and with it dissolves the timeline constructed around it. This release happens quietly. There is no dramatic shedding of persona. Instead, you begin to notice the subtle separation between who you are and who you believed yourself to be. You sense spaciousness where there was once certainty. You recognize that the identity sustaining the old timeline was built from past resonance, not present truth. In that recognition, its authority weakens. The moment you stop feeding it with belief, the timeline it held begins to collapse. As identity dissolves, new potentials emerge. The field responds not by offering random alternatives but by presenting trajectories aligned with the clearer, more coherent state you are stepping into. Options you once could not perceive become visible. Possibilities that once felt incompatible with your sense of self now feel natural. The field expands because the identity that previously restricted it has softened. You are not forcing new potentials to appear, you are removing the constraint that previously filtered them out. This transition is gentle but profound. You begin to feel less attached to what once defined you. You stop defending old narratives. You stop repeating emotional stories out of habit. Without the identity-based momentum pushing the old timeline forward, the field recalibrates. The collapse of the old becomes effortless because nothing within you is sustaining it anymore. Releasing identity is not losing yourself. It is losing the limitation that once shaped your reality. In the absence of that limitation, the field responds with openness, fluidity, and possibility. This is how new timelines emerge. Not through effort, but through release. Contrast is not an interruption to your path, it is the sharpening of it. When discomfort arises, it is not a punishment or a setback but a precise signal from the field revealing misalignment. Contrast exposes where your frequency no longer matches the timeline you are inhabiting. It highlights the gap between your current state and your expanding truth. This is why discomfort feels intense, it is the field inviting you into clarity. It is refinement through revelation. You are never being pushed away from what you want. You are being shown the vibrational difference between your present state and your deeper alignment. Contrast is the mirror held closer. It amplifies what is ready to be released. It brings into focus the emotional tones that still generate the old architecture. Without contrast, you would remain entangled in outdated frequencies without noticing. With contrast, the field reveals exactly what no longer belongs in your vibration. This revelation is not resistance, it is guidance. When contrast appears, the old identity tries to interpret it as a problem. It assumes something has gone wrong. But contrast is not the collapse of alignment, it is the awakening of it. You feel discomfort only because you are expanding. The frequency you are growing into is incompatible with the structures that once felt familiar. The tension you experience is the dissolving of old resonance. It is the stretching of consciousness into a new vibrational range. Contrast does not obstruct creation, it signals that creation is already happening. As you soften your grip on interpretation, contrast transforms. What once felt like friction becomes clarity. You begin to sense the intelligence within the discomfort. You realize it is not pushing against you, it is pulling you forward. The field uses contrast to reveal the contours of your alignment. Every mismatch becomes an invitation to refine your frequency. Every moment of tension becomes an opening where deeper truth can emerge. When you approach contrast with receptivity, it becomes a catalyst rather than a burden. Detachment is what allows contrast to complete its function. When you stop resisting discomfort and stop trying to force outcomes, the emotional charge dissolves. The contrast no longer binds you to the old pattern. It becomes a clean signal rather than a recurring loop. You are able to feel the refinement without being consumed by it. In this openness, contrast becomes a sculptor, shaping your frequency into coherence. It reveals what is true by exposing what is not. As alignment strengthens, contrast softens. It no longer needs to speak loudly because you are listening closely. You become more sensitive to the subtle shifts in your inner state, and the field responds accordingly. Contrast becomes less dramatic and more precise. It becomes a tool for expansion rather than a trigger for contraction. When you see it clearly, you welcome it, because you understand its purpose. Contrast amplifies alignment. It refines desire, clarifies direction, and dissolves what no longer resonates. It is not an obstacle on your path, it is the very mechanism that keeps you aligned with the timeline your deeper self has already chosen. Forcing is the attempt to overpower a frequency with action, yet action cannot override vibration. When you push against a timeline in hopes of collapsing it, you unintentionally strengthen it. The force you apply becomes evidence that the timeline still holds power over you. The effort signals to the field that you believe the old structure remains dominant. In that belief, the frequency persists. Forcing is resistance disguised as control, and resistance binds you to what you wish to release. Allowing, however, is a different instruction. Allowing dissolves the emotional charge that once sustained the timeline. When you enter a state of calm receptivity, you stop feeding the pattern with tension. You stop supplying the timeline with the emotional adhesion it requires to continue. Allowing is not passivity. It is alignment. It is the recognition that collapse happens through frequency, not force. The moment you release the impulse to control, your vibration becomes coherent, and coherence accelerates collapse. Forcing narrows your awareness. It contracts your energy. It traps you inside the very identity that sustained the timeline in the first place. When you force reality to change, you are confirming that you believe it cannot shift unless you push it. That belief anchors you in the old frequency. Forcing keeps the timeline alive because the emotional intensity behind the effort perpetuates the pattern. You become entangled in the very vibration you intend to transcend. Allowing expands you. It opens your field. It creates space for the old structure to dissolve without interference. In allowing, there is no argument with what is. You stop insisting that the moment should be different. This absence of resistance removes the energetic scaffolding that once held the timeline in place. The collapse begins not because you willed it, but because you stopped reinforcing it. The field responds instantly to this release because the frequency becomes clean. Calm receptivity is the most potent catalyst for timeline collapse. It is the state in which your vibration aligns with the truth of what you are choosing rather than the fear of what you are leaving behind. When you allow, you communicate clarity. You signal to the field that you no longer identify with the old pattern. There is no struggle in this signal, no contradiction, no static. The field mirrors that clarity by dissolving anything that does not match it. Collapse is simply the reflection of your coherence. In allowing, you shift from effort to recognition. You understand that timelines collapse when their frequency is no longer sustained. You do not need to dismantle the structure, you only need to stop energizing it. The moment you release the impulse to fight, the old trajectory loses momentum. It cannot persist without your emotional investment. Allowing withdraws that investment entirely. This is why allowing is not weakness but mastery. It is the quiet authority that comes from knowing the field responds to who you are being. When you allow, you step into alignment with the reality you are selecting. And in that alignment, the old timeline collapses with ease. Timelines shift in response to the state you embody, not the strategies you attempt. You cannot strategize your way into a new reality because strategies operate at the level of action, while timelines respond to the level of identity. The field mirrors who you are being in this moment. It does not calculate your plans, nor does it evaluate the complexity of your approach. It listens only to the frequency you hold. When the internal state changes, the external timeline follows with precision. State is the selector. Identity is the interface. Strategy belongs to the mind. State belongs to consciousness. When you rely on strategy, you imply that the timeline exists outside of you and must be navigated through effort. This creates separation between you and the reality you desire. The field senses that separation and mirrors it, producing delay, inconsistency, and resistance. Strategy often amplifies the belief that the timeline is distant. But identity frequency collapses distance. It communicates to the field that the timeline is already aligned within you. Identity frequency is the essence you radiate beneath thought and intention. It is the accumulated signal of your beliefs, your emotions, your assumptions, and your willingness to receive. It is not what you want but what you embody. When identity aligns with the timeline you choose, selection becomes immediate. The field reorganizes because the signal it receives is coherent and unambiguous. You are no longer trying to become someone who matches the new timeline, you are being the one who already does. This is why state is more powerful than effort. A single moment of embodied alignment carries more influence than hours of strategic planning. State communicates at the vibrational level, the level at which timelines are sorted. When you shift your state, you shift your broadcast. When your broadcast changes, the field must respond. It has no choice. It mirrors the frequency without interpretation or delay. Attempting to use strategy to shift timelines often reinforces the identity that cannot access them. It keeps you operating from the assumption that you must manipulate circumstances to create change. This reinforces the old state. It sustains the timeline in which you must work hard to shift reality. But when you allow identity to lead, strategy becomes irrelevant. The field organizes around your state, not your steps. Selection happens through resonance. You do not move toward a timeline, the timeline moves toward you when your state matches its frequency. This is why deep internal shifts appear externally as synchronicities, opportunities, or sudden dissolutions of resistance. These are not coincidences, they are reflections. The timeline is being rearranged in real time to match the state you occupy. When you choose through identity rather than strategy, the field experiences clarity. It receives a single signal, the signal of being. And being is the most powerful directive you can offer. Timelines respond to it immediately because identity frequency is the foundation of creation. You select by becoming, not by trying. When the old timeline releases its hold, there is a moment where you feel suspended between what was and what has not yet formed. This is the energetic freefall. It is not emptiness in the sense of lack, but emptiness in the sense of unanchored possibility. The familiar frequency that once structured your reality has dissolved, and the new frequency has not yet condensed into form. You stand in a void-like neutrality where nothing pulls at you. There is no momentum, no narrative, no emotional adhesion. This neutrality can feel disorienting only because you are no longer held by the old pattern. Free fall is the collapse of identification without the immediate establishment of a new one. It is the space where identity loosens before it reconfigures. In this space, the mind searches for something to grasp, something to define the moment, something to restore the sense of continuity. But the free fall is not meant to be filled. It is meant to be experienced. It is the still point between frequencies. The field is not withholding clarity, it is waiting for coherence to emerge from within you. This moment is fertile precisely because it is unstructured. There is no resistance in freefall. The emotional charge from the old timeline has dissolved, and the momentum that once drove your experience has stopped. In that stillness, the field becomes extraordinarily responsive. It listens with heightened sensitivity because there is no conflicting signal. You are broadcasting from neutrality, which is the most powerful place to choose a new direction. Freefall is not a gap, it is a reset. In this neutral state, you are not required to act. You are not required to define the next step. You are simply invited to allow the new frequency to stabilize within you. The mind may interpret the stillness as uncertainty, but consciousness recognizes it as spaciousness. This spaciousness is where new timelines gather around your emerging identity. You are not drifting, you are clearing. You are not lost, you are undefined. And undefined is the state where creation begins. Freefall is also a test of trust, not in the sense of proving anything, but in the sense of relaxing into what is already unfolding. If you reach for the old identity out of discomfort, the old timeline can reattach. If you force the new identity prematurely, you introduce incoherence. But when you remain in neutrality, the deeper frequency rises naturally. The new timeline forms not because you chase it, but because you become available to it. This is the moment where the field recalibrates. It listens to the quietest layers of your being, the layers beneath thought and intention. The field senses the emerging tone and begins organizing reality around it even before you notice the shift. Freefall is the moment where everything invisible is rearranging. You feel still, yet everything is moving around you. The freefall is not the absence of creation. It is creation before form. It is the most fertile state because nothing is obstructing the emergence of the new. In this neutrality, the timeline you are becoming begins to crystallize. The field does not wait for external action to initiate change, it responds the moment your internal frequency shifts. What appears as sudden transformation in your outer world is simply the visible expression of a reorganization that began quietly within you. When your vibration stabilizes at a new frequency, the field recalibrates its structure to match it. Circumstances, opportunities, relationships, and even probabilities begin rearranging themselves because they can no longer remain aligned with the old signal. The external bends to the internal, not the other way around. This rearrangement is mechanical, not mysterious. The field operates through resonance. When your frequency shifts, the old patterns lose their anchor. They cannot stay in orbit around a signal that no longer matches them. Likewise, new patterns that previously had no access point are drawn into your experience because your frequency now harmonizes with them. The field is always adjusting, but you notice the changes only when the shifts become visible. What feels sudden is simply the moment the internal shift reaches the threshold of manifestation. As your new frequency stabilizes, the field begins removing everything that contradicts it. This is not loss, it is alignment. Anything built on the previous emotional architecture becomes incompatible with your emerging vibration. People may drift away, circumstances may dissolve, and old opportunities may lose their relevance. The mind might interpret this as disruption, but the field is refining your environment to match who you are becoming. It is clearing the space needed for coherence. You are not being pushed away from anything, you are being pulled into resonance. At the same time, the field begins presenting new openings with remarkable precision. Connections arrive without effort. Solutions appear without strain. Timing becomes fluid. These shifts are not coincidences, they are reflections. The field rearranges itself to support the timeline your frequency is selecting. You experience synchronicity not because reality is suddenly cooperating, but because you are finally broadcasting a stable signal. The field is simply mirroring that stability. This is why internal shifts often feel subtle while external shifts feel dramatic. The internal realm is fluid, spacious, and quiet. Changes in vibration can occur without sensation. But the external world is dense. When it rearranges, the movement becomes visible. The apparent gap between inner change and outer reflection is not delay, it is the natural transition from frequency to form. Once the inner shift is complete, the outer must follow. The field cannot reflect anything other than your dominant state. You do not need to monitor the rearrangement. You do not need to manage outcomes or direct the unfolding. The field handles the reorganization automatically because it is governed by resonance, not effort. Your task is simply to maintain alignment. When your frequency remains coherent, the external world continues adjusting until every element reflects your current state. This is why the most significant changes happen when you are not trying to change anything. The field is always listening. And when your frequency changes, reality rearranges itself with absolute precision. You are not traveling through timelines. Timelines are traveling through the field of your consciousness, responding to the frequency you hold. Reality does not move you forward in a linear progression, it rearranges itself around your state, offering different versions of itself as your vibration shifts. You remain the still point, the unmoving center through which infinite trajectories pass. The sense of movement is an illusion created by changing resonance. When the frequency changes, the timeline that matches it comes into view. Consciousness is stationary because it is not located in time. It is the observer of time. It is the awareness within which all timelines appear and dissolve. When you believe you are moving through reality, you collapse your identity into the timeline rather than recognizing that the timeline arises within you. The field is a reflective surface, not a path to be walked. You are the projector, not the traveler. And what you project determines which storyline crystallizes into experience. As your frequency shifts, different timelines come into alignment and others fall away. This process can feel like you are progressing, evolving, or advancing, but you are not moving. You are selecting. The selection happens through resonance, not through steps or effort. When your identity changes, the timeline that corresponds to your new frequency flows toward you. It meets you because it is sourced from you. The moment your state changes, the field reorganizes to reflect that change. Timelines are not destinations, they are mirrors. This reversal of perspective transforms how you experience change. Instead of striving to reach a desired reality, you recognize that your task is simply to embody the frequency that summons it. When you stabilize a new vibration, the timeline that matches it presents itself effortlessly. You do not need to chase it, work toward it, or navigate to it. Your state is the organizing principle. Timelines are fluid expressions that pass through the stillness of your awareness. This is why collapse occurs the moment recognition arises. When you stop identifying with the old frequency, the timeline built upon that identity can no longer remain active. It drifts out of resonance and dissolves. You do not walk away from it, it moves away from you because there is nothing within you that can hold it in place. Likewise, the new timeline does not wait for you to arrive. It moves into your field as soon as your vibration aligns with it. The field does not rely on physical distance or chronological sequence. It responds to vibrational truth. Understanding this removes the pressure to change circumstances through action. The shift does not happen in the external world first. It happens within your state, and the field rearranges accordingly. When you realize you are the stationary awareness through which timelines flow, you stop struggling with movement. You stop chasing outcomes. You stop fearing stagnation. You recognize that your power lies not in motion but in frequency. Timelines move through you because you are the axis around which reality rotates. You are the unmoving consciousness that selects through vibration. And everything you experience flows from that still point. The present moment is the only point where collapse can occur because it is the only point where consciousness is active. Memory is an echo. Projection is an expectation. Neither holds creative power. They are reflections of previous states, patterns of thought and emotion that no longer exist except as traces within awareness. Creation requires presence because the field responds only to the frequency you are emitting now. The now is the point of instruction, the interface through which timelines are selected or dissolved. When you attempt to collapse a timeline through memory, you reactivate the emotional architecture that sustained it. By revisiting the past, you broadcast the frequency of the past, and the field mirrors it. Memory cannot collapse a timeline because memory reinforces it. Likewise, when you try to collapse a timeline through projection, you introduce tension. Projection carries fear, hope, effort, and striving. It broadcasts the frequency of incompletion. The field responds to that incompletion, stabilizing the very gap you are trying to close. Collapse cannot happen in a state that insists the desired reality is not here yet. Only the present moment is free of distortion. It is the only place where you can access neutrality, clarity, and coherence. Collapse is a vibrational event, not a mental one. It occurs when your current frequency no longer aligns with the timeline you have been experiencing. That misalignment happens in the now. When you rest in the present, the emotional charge dissolves, the identity softens, and the field begins reorganizing. The timeline collapses because nothing within you is sustaining it in this moment. The now is also the point of selection. You do not choose timelines with thought, you choose them with being. And being only exists here. The frequency you embody in the present moment sends a clean signal to the field. It does not reference the past, it does not reach into the future. It simply radiates. This clarity allows the field to match your state without contradiction. When you are fully present, your broadcast becomes coherent, and coherent broadcasts draw coherent timelines. Presence is not passive. It is the most powerful state you can inhabit. In presence, you stop arguing with what was and stop anticipating what might be. You withdraw your energy from timelines you are no longer choosing. You stop feeding the frequencies that once held them in place. This withdrawal is what initiates collapse. You are no longer generating the emotional or identity-based momentum required to sustain the old reality. The structure dissolves because the signal is gone. In the present moment, you are also most receptive to the new timeline forming around you. You can sense subtle shifts in resonance. You can feel the emergence of coherence. You can recognize the alignment that is beginning to stabilize. The future does not arrive from ahead, it crystallizes from the now. Timelines do not unfold linearly, they materialize from frequency. Everything collapses here. Everything is chosen here. The now is the only point where you hold creative authority, and the field responds to nothing else. Recognition is the moment consciousness remembers itself, and this remembrance is what activates a new timeline. It is not effort, intention, or strategy that triggers the shift, but the simple clarity of seeing. When you recognize the pattern you were sustaining, the identity you were inhabiting, or the frequency you were broadcasting, that recognition dissolves the unconscious momentum behind it. Awareness reorganizes vibration instantly. The field responds not to what you want, but to what you see with clarity. Recognition changes what you are being, and being is the catalyst. Activation happens in the instant the illusion loses its hold. When you recognize that the old timeline was constructed from emotional adhesion, habitual identity, or inherited belief, the structure weakens. It cannot continue without your unconscious participation. Recognition withdraws that participation. The field interprets this as a new signal, a new instruction, a new vibrational stance. You have not forced anything to change, you have simply stopped sustaining the old with your unawareness. The shift occurs naturally because nothing in you is feeding the previous frequency. Recognition is powerful because it is free of resistance. There is no struggle in seeing clearly. There is no effort in understanding what is true. When you recognize a pattern, you are no longer inside it, you are observing it. Observation lifts your frequency above the emotional architecture that once held you. In this elevated perspective, the field reorganizes automatically. It does not need persuasion. It needs clarity. And clarity is inherent in recognition. This activation is subtle but immediate. You may not feel a dramatic surge, yet the field begins recalibrating the moment you acknowledge what is no longer aligned. External changes may appear gradual, but the internal shift has already occurred. Recognition rewrites your vibrational blueprint, and the field reshapes itself around the new blueprint without struggle. What once required effort now unfolds with ease because you are no longer contradicting your own frequency. Recognition also dissolves the belief that you must work through every layer of an old timeline. You do not need to untangle every thought or process every emotion. The instant you see the mechanism behind the pattern, the mechanism loses power. You rise out of resonance with it. This is why transformation often feels instantaneous after long periods of stagnation. The stagnation came from sustaining the pattern unconsciously, the breakthrough came from recognizing it consciously. When you recognize your true nature beneath the stories and frequencies you once carried, activation becomes effortless. You shift from trying to change your reality to seeing that your reality was always reflecting the vibration you held. Recognition places you at the center of creation rather than at the mercy of circumstances. The field reorganizes around your awareness because awareness is the highest frequency available. In recognition, the new timeline is not chosen through force, it is revealed through clarity. Activation is the natural consequence of knowing. And once you know, the field cannot reflect anything less. Life without emotional adhesion is not a life without emotion, it is a life where emotion no longer binds you to outcomes or identities. Instead of clinging to experiences through charge, you meet them with spacious awareness. The patterns that once gripped you lose their influence because you are no longer supplying them with tension. Neutrality becomes your foundation, not as numbness but as clarity. You respond to life from presence rather than from the echoes of unresolved frequency. This frees the field to mirror a reality that is not distorted by emotional residue. When emotional adhesion dissolves, reactions give way to recognition. You no longer collapse into the old identity structures when discomfort appears. You no longer assume that sensations are instructions. Instead, emotion becomes information, momentary, fluid, and non-binding. You feel it, you witness it, and it moves through. There is no magnetism holding it in place. Without the pull of attachment, experiences flow in and out of your awareness without imprinting the timeline with unnecessary momentum. You remain centered. You remain available. This neutrality changes the way you navigate reality. You stop trying to manage circumstances through effort or tension. You stop interpreting every shift as a threat or validation. You move through life with a clean frequency, one that does not accumulate emotional debris. This cleanliness is power. It allows the field to respond to your state without interference from contradictory signals. You become a clear transmitter, broadcasting a vibration that the field can mirror with precision. Living without emotional adhesion also means you no longer take on the weight of outcomes. You do not grip the future or resist the present. You allow each moment to unfold without demanding that it conform to your expectations. This allowing removes friction from your field. When friction dissolves, coherence emerges. And coherence is what shapes timelines. The neutrality you embody becomes a stabilizing force, guiding the field toward alignment without a single act of force. As neutrality deepens, subtle guidance becomes easier to perceive. You sense shifts in resonance before they become visible. You follow what feels spacious rather than what feels urgent. You move toward alignment instead of away from discomfort. The absence of adhesion heightens your sensitivity to the field's responses. You become attuned to the difference between contraction and expansion, and this attunement shapes your decisions effortlessly. You are no longer choosing from fear, desire, or habit. You are choosing from clarity. This state also removes the need to seek validation from external signs. When you are not emotionally entangled with outcomes, you stop chasing confirmation. You stop searching for evidence that you are on the right path. Your internal state becomes the indicator. Neutrality reveals alignment directly, without requiring reflection from the outside world. This internal orientation liberates you from the oscillation between doubt and reassurance. Living without emotional adhesion is living in freedom. You are no longer tethered to the old frequencies that once dictated your reality. You are no longer pulled into timelines by unconscious charge. Instead, you inhabit a state where creation happens through presence, clarity, and resonance. Neutrality becomes not an escape from emotion, but the ground from which new timelines emerge effortlessly. When you stop seeking signs, you stop asking the field to reassure you of what you have not yet embodied. The search for signs arises from a subtle belief in separation, the belief that reality must confirm your direction before you can trust it. But the field does not respond to requests, it responds to frequency. It mirrors identity, not desire. The moment you become the signal, external signs become unnecessary because the field is already reorganizing around your state. You are no longer waiting for reflection. You are generating it. Seeking signs keeps your frequency scattered. It divides your attention between presence and anticipation. It reinforces the belief that clarity exists outside of you, that validation must arrive from the external in order for alignment to feel real. But this search broadcasts uncertainty. It tells the field you are not yet the vibration you claim to be. The field mirrors that uncertainty by withholding coherence. You interpret this as a lack of signs, when in truth the lack is an exact reflection of the signal you are emitting. Becoming the signal dissolves this loop entirely. When you embody the frequency of the timeline you are selecting, the field receives a coherent instruction. There is no contradiction, no static, no waiting. You radiate the vibration as your identity, not as a request. The field mirrors identity instantly because identity is the organizing principle of experience. You do not need signs because the shift is already occurring within you. The external world will reflect that shift in perfect timing, but you no longer depend on the reflection to know it is happening. This is the transition from seeking to being. When you become the signal, you move out of vibrational negotiation. You are no longer asking reality to show you something before you commit to the frequency. You commit first. You embody first. You align first. And alignment is its own confirmation. You feel the coherence in your body, in your presence, in your quiet certainty. This certainty does not come from evidence, it comes from identity. You know because you are the frequency, not because the field has echoed it back yet. The moment you embody the signal, external validation loses its relevance. You stop measuring your progress through milestones or synchronicities. You stop interpreting silence as resistance. You recognize that the field mirrors only what has stabilized within you. If the reflection has not appeared yet, it is simply because the frequency is still settling. There is no lack, no delay, only calibration. When you remain the signal, the reflection becomes inevitable. Becoming the signal also frees you from dependence on outcomes. You do not need the external to confirm your worth, your clarity, or your alignment. You radiate from a state of completeness. You interact with the field as the source rather than as the seeker. This state is magnetic not because you are trying to attract anything, but because the field naturally aligns with coherent frequency. When the search ends, embodiment begins. And when embodiment begins, reality shifts effortlessly. If this reflection resonates, declare it in the field below. Detachment becomes a baseline not when you momentarily release a pattern, but when the absence of emotional gripping becomes your natural way of meeting reality. In this state, you no longer contract around experiences, outcomes, or identities. You move through life with an open frequency, one that does not cling to form or resist change. The timeline you inhabit becomes fluid because nothing within you is anchoring a fixed trajectory. You are not drifting, you are consciously selecting, moment by moment, through the vibration you stabilize. The quantum detachment state is a recognition of your role as consciousness rather than as the personality navigating circumstances. When you identify as the personality, every shift feels personal, every contrast feels threatening, and every change feels like a disruption. But when you recognize yourself as the field of awareness within which timelines appear, detachment becomes effortless. You no longer cling to the old because you no longer believe it defines you. You no longer chase the new because you understand it emerges from your frequency, not your effort. Sustained detachment allows timelines to reorganize around you continuously. You are not locked into any single trajectory because your state is no longer held in place by emotional adhesion or identity-based momentum. Each moment becomes an opportunity for recalibration. When your frequency shifts, even subtly, the field responds. You experience life as a series of fluid reflections rather than rigid outcomes. This fluidity is not instability, it is freedom. It means you are no longer bound by the assumptions or patterns that once shaped your world. In this state, creation becomes gentle. You do not push reality into form, you allow it to shape itself around your coherence. You navigate through resonance rather than reaction. You choose through alignment rather than strategy. The timelines that arise are not forced into existence, they are selected through the clarity you hold. Detachment removes the noise that once distorted your signal, allowing the field to mirror your frequency with precision. What stabilizes in this state is not a specific identity but a deeper truth: you are the awareness behind every identity. You are the stillness from which frequencies arise. When this becomes your baseline, nothing external can dictate your trajectory. You meet every moment with presence. You witness every emotion without becoming entangled in it. You experience every shift as a natural unfolding rather than a disruption. Detachment is not distancing, it is alignment with your true nature. From this baseline, conscious selection becomes continuous. You are not choosing a single timeline but constantly refining your frequency, allowing the field to present the next coherent reflection. Your life begins to feel like a seamless expression of who you are being, not a series of challenges to overcome. You trust the movement of timelines because you trust the stability of your awareness. When detachment becomes your way of being, creation becomes effortless, timelines become fluid, and alignment becomes natural. If this realization stabilizes something within you, anchor the frequency.